and welcome to another little chat with Tim. I want to continue what we talked about last time about generational trauma. And what we saw is that it's impossible to understand complex trauma without realizing that if a person doesn't deal with their trauma, they will pass it on to their loved ones, to their children, the next generation. If their children don't deal with it, they then pass it on to their children, and it becomes a generational thing. And as it progresses to each generation, it tends to get a little bit worse and a little bit worse until often it can take over whole communities. And it's just, to me, such a tragic, sad part of complex trauma. But what we've been wanting to see is you can stop the cycle. You can be the one that says, I'm going to get healthy so that I don't pass it on. I'm going to work on my trauma and not avoid it anymore so that I can be healthy enough to break the cycle. What I want to just talk about today is just what are the symptoms of generational trauma? What do I look for? Because what I get, again, so many people go, I grew up in a very safe country, a safe environment, a safe neighborhood. All my physical needs were taken care of. Why do I have the symptoms of trauma? And so it could be because your parents had trauma that they never dealt with. And they provided lots of good things for you, but you were picking up their trauma. And that's what I want to talk about today. What are some of the signs and symptoms of generational trauma? So you're going to have usually a heightened sensitivity to stress. So other people can be quite cool under stress, but you get dysregulated fairly soon as you start feeling stress. You get panicky, you get on edge, antsy, all of those different things. You have unexplained feelings of fear that you're not sure where they come from, or unexplained feelings of grief and loss that you just feel, or unexplained feelings of shame that you just have this, I don't feel good enough. I feel less than. Where does that come from? And then you have unhealthy patterns of coping that you can't quite explain. So lots of anger, aggression issues, lots of just avoid, numb out, or addiction. And that could be not just drugs and alcohol, that could be food, sex, gambling, shopping, whatever. Where does that come from? And then you just have great difficulty in relationships when it comes to trust or connecting with people or your identity, who you are, do you have value? And then you often feel like you're just carrying a burden all the time that it's not yours, but it's there. Why do you have this heaviness of a burden that you always feel? Then there's health issues. So why do you have health issues when you eat well, you exercise well, you sleep well, but you still have heart disease, diabetes, cancer, autoimmune problems? What's that all about? And then within your community, your ethnic group, the mortality rates seem to be higher than in other groups. There seems to be more mental health issues, anxiety and depression, more suicides than in other groups. And then there's just more shame issues. There's just this low self-esteem, low identity, lack of self-worth, identity that feels less than everybody. And then there's often an emotional numbness. People just aren't expressive of emotions. They're just flat. They're just unaffected emotionally, almost robotic about stuff. So it's very much a depersonalization, that they feel detached from themselves. They feel detached from their surroundings. It's like they're going through life watching stuff happen to themselves and others, but they don't really connect to it. And then impaired life skills. So they just realize that they have trouble with thinking, that others might say you got some cognitive issues here, can't quite figure out why, trouble making decisions, trouble managing your time well, always giving into procrastination. What's that about? And then they don't develop normally. So if you go through a child's normal stages of development, it's like they regress or just stop growing in certain areas and maybe grow in others, but there's something that has interrupted their personal growth in their life. And then you have in your communities, there seems to be a prevalence of child abuse sexually and domestic violence. Those become very common things, and higher incidence than most communities of alcohol abuse. So somebody said these symptoms become social tendencies, such as collective numbness, born from mass dissociation and denial of the historical trauma, including its root causes and consequences. Collective numbness surfaces as epidemic substance misuse, food, sex, entertainment, addiction, media overuse, and many other forms. It reveals itself as a collective shutting down to crisis as much as to healing. So they're trying to shut down all the pain, but they're also shutting down healthy. Then it's like your community and your person carries this unresolved grief deep inside of them. There's just a deep, deep sense of loss that hard to put your finger on. For some, there's just a hopelessness that begins to dominate their thinking about life. And then a lot of distrust, suspicion, doubt about everything, very negative outlook begins to dominate. Some develop a learned helplessness. What's the point of even trying? Won't make a difference. So they just learn to be helpless. And then you will find there's just this underlying deep lava of anger. And it will come out at times in aggression and violence against self, property, others, including your own family. So just an anger that's deep below the surface that you sense, that's there. Some people respond by then hating their own ethnic group. They're ashamed of being that ethnic group because they see all the problems. They see how it just is going downhill. It seems so hopeless. And they just hate the fact that they are part of that group. And that just adds to their shame. Bessel van der Kolk said this: many traumatized people expose themselves seemingly compulsively to situations reminiscent of the original trauma. These behavioral reenactments are rarely consciously understood to be related to earlier life experiences. In other words, traumatized individuals, without realizing it, so out of a subconscious place, actually put themselves in places to be where they're going to be re-traumatized. So they have shut down so many systems. Their templates require danger in order to feel normal and require unsafe people in order to feel normal. They've shut down their gut. They've shut down all kinds of important alarm systems. So they walk into or are drawn into danger and then get re-traumatized. And they go, why in the world does this happen so often to me? And then one of those templates that makes this happen is all the people in your life have been narcissistic, unsafe, angry, violent, and that's your normal. You learn how to live with that. And so now as you go into adult life, you're somehow drawn to bad boys, to angry people, to people who will abuse authority, to people who are controlling, to people who are narcissistic, and then you get traumatized again. And then it spreads into the community. And this is where then everybody who's traumatized, Those are the only ones then that are available for positions of authority. They don't know how to handle authority in loving ways. They then abuse authority and even spread trauma even more in communities. And so now it goes from the family to the community, and people are getting traumatized at all kinds of different levels. When I talk to the Indigenous leaders, one of the things that came out of that conversation that I found very fascinating, and I had read about others talking about this, and it's like the more the generational trauma continues, the more you get unhealthy people in leadership, because the pool to draw leadership from of healthy gets smaller and smaller and smaller as the generational trauma continues. And so at what point do you say we can no longer fix the trauma from within our own ethnic group because there's the pool of healthy people to draw on has become so small to almost non-existent? We now have to go outside of our own ethnic group to try and get help. That was part of the discussion. And so that's sadly what can begin to happen. Another aspect that comes out of generational trauma is trauma bonds. So when the only people that you can connect to are hurting you, and you need to connect with them because you can't meet your own needs, and maybe once in a while they are nice to you, you form trauma bonds. And now you are loyal to them. Now you don't want to talk about stuff. You want to protect them. And so that prevents you from dealing with your own trauma. But then you're drawn to people like that to recreate the bonds. And so there's almost this constant hope. I want to connect with them. Even though they're cruel, even though they hurt me, I still want to connect with them to get them to validate me. And you keep chasing that, getting your hopes up to get hurt over and over again. And it's almost like there's a rush from the chase that can come out of that. I think the final thing that I would say, what happens as generational trauma continues is, so Thomas Hubble has said this: in the Middle East, violent conflict has persisted over centuries and generations, culminating in a powerful polarization of the people of the region, splitting nationalities, ethnicities, and religions into fractured and warring identities. This energy of polarization regenerates the original crisis without resolution. After eruptive energy is expended, its primary contents are once again suppressed. In other words, when you originally are traumatized by outside people, so let's say the white man of the indigenous people, terrible trauma, then what can begin to happen is the white man continues to do that. So the white man becomes the enemy. But then as it goes beyond that even more, anybody that's not our own ethnicity is the enemy. And then, as it keeps going, anybody within our ethnicity that doesn't quite follow our customs, our religion, they're the enemy. So you become suspicious of everybody. And we see this happening around the world today, where a distrust grows of anybody who's not like us. That's generational trauma. That's the cumulative effect. So can't trust anybody, can't love others who are outside my little domain. My world gets smaller and smaller. That's the only way I think I can feel safe. But what it does is it actually just keeps recreating the trauma, because now everybody's in the enemy. I'm in constant fear. I am lashing out. And they begin to lash out, and the trauma continues. So Thomas Hubble also says this: indeed, it is my belief that unresolved, systemic, multi-generational traumas delay the development of the human family, harm the natural world, and inhibit the higher evolution of our species. Unhealed collective trauma may place similar burdens on the health of human cultures and societies, even placing our planetary home at risk. Now that sounds very dire, but I think there's so much truth in that. If we don't deal with that generational trauma, it makes our world gradually a more and more dangerous place, a more and more unhealthy place. It just does so much destruction, not just in the family. So how do we heal? So what did we see last time? That the original response when there's this big collective trauma from the outside to a group of people, so they're in the position of power and authority, they traumatize you, they abuse you, you can't talk about it. The emotional defense to trauma from the outside is repression. It is the emotional defense mechanism of repression that trivializes our memories and strips them of meaning. Repression protects us by splitting a memory from its emotional significance. In those cases, the trauma is held in the mind as an event that's not a big deal, nothing important. We don't need to go there. The disconnect between ideas and feelings allows us to protect ourselves from feeling something too. It's a form of denial that's the original response. So Dr. Judith Herman says, the ordinary response to atrocities is to banish them from our consciousness. Certain violations of the social compact are too terrible to utter out aloud. That is the meaning of the word unspeakable. Atrocities, however, refuse to be buried. Equally as powerful as the desire to deny atrocities is the conviction that denial does not work. Folk wisdom is filled with ghosts who refuse to rest in their graves until their stories are told. Murder will out. Remembering and telling the truth about terrible events are prerequisites, both for the restoration of the social order and for the healing of individual victims. The conflict between the will to deny horrible events and the will to proclaim them aloud is the central dialectic of psychological trauma. People who have survived atrocities often tell their stories in a highly emotional, contradictory, and fragmented manner which undermines their credibility and thereby serves the twin imperatives of truth-telling and secrecy. When the truth is finally recognized, survivors can begin their recovery. But far too often their secrecy prevails and the story of the traumatic event surfaces not as a verbal narrative, but as a symptom. So start talking about stuff. That's the beginning, but that's the first step. That's not going to just magically fix you to talk about it, but it's going to get the process started. Then work on yourself. And again, that's work on your complex trauma. You can't change the whole system, but you can start changing you. And that will begin to have an impact and influence. And then you can get involved in changing the system, but start with you. And that's again where courses like our Lift course will help you to do that. But then you need good boundaries, because what you're trying to do often is heal within a culture and environment that's quite unhealthy and unsafe. And so you might have to step outside of your culture for a while and move away geographically just so that you can heal and then maybe return. Or you can just set boundaries and not associate with certain people for a while so that you can heal within your culture. But you're going to need really good boundaries in order for this to happen. And then thankfully what's happening today in many cultures is they're developing a realization that we need to heal together. We need to share our stories. We need truth and reconciliation. And so we need to begin to engage in social customs, powwows, sweat lodges, where we begin to do cultural things to heal together. So it's possible to heal. There's an individual piece, there's a cultural piece. Start with the individual. And I think you'll begin to realize you can make a huge difference. Hi, and welcome again, everyone. I just want to make you aware of something we're offering going into November that I'm quite excited about. We have two courses that one is a very foundational course, Align with Your 12 Needs, and it's really the foundation work of much of what we teach and really helps people in recovery. And we have one that's all about complex trauma and how it affects the love languages and how you experience love. The Align with Your Needs course normally would sell for $450, but in the beginning of November, we want to take these two courses and offer them to you for $50 US as part of this wellness bundle. Now, even if you don't want all of those other resources, just having these two courses for $50 US to me is just a wonderful deal for people. So if you're wanting to do a deeper dive into understanding your 12 needs, how they got disrupted or not met in complex trauma, how to learn to meet those needs, understand those needs, because that's what recovery is about, I would really encourage you to look into this. So if you want more details, they're in the description. Thank you very much.